There is a question that follows Jesus through the entire Gospel of John. The religious leaders ask it in the temple courts. His own disciples ask it in private. The crowd asks it in the streets. And every single time, Jesus refuses to answer it directly. The question is simple, 3 words, "Who are you?" And the man who claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life never once gave a clean, categorical answer. That is not an accident. And it is not humility. It is one of the most carefully constructed communication strategies in the ancient world. And once you see it, you will never read the Gospels the same way again. Most people assume Jesus avoided the question because he was being evasive or mysterious, or because he was protecting himself from arrest. But that is not the full story. The real reason cuts much deeper. It has to do with language, with power, with the nature of identity in the ancient Near East, and with a trap so sophisticated that a direct answer would have destroyed everything Jesus came to do. To understand why, you have to go back to a moment that happened roughly 1400 years before Jesus was born. A shepherd stands at the edge of a burning desert. He has been exiled from Egypt, the only home he ever knew. He has spent 40 years tending sheep on the backside of a mountain that most people had forgotten existed. His name is Moses. And he is looking at a bush that is on fire but is not burning up. The Hebrew text of Exodus chapter 3 does something that most English translations flatten almost entirely. It says the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. The word translated consumed is the Hebrew word akal, which means to eat, to devour, to use up. The fire was eating, and the bush was not being eaten. Something was present in that flame that operated outside the normal rules of how fire and matter relate to each other. When Moses asks the voice speaking from that bush what name he should give when the Israelites ask who sent him, the answer he receives is one of the strangest sentences in all of ancient literature. I-A-M-W-H-O, I-A-M. In Hebrew, this is 4 letters, Yod, Heh, Vav, Heh, the Tetragrammaton, the name so sacred that most Jewish readers of the 1st century would not speak it aloud. When they encountered it in the text, they would substitute the word Adonai, meaning Lord, or sometimes Hashem, meaning simply the name. The name itself is derived from the Hebrew verb hayah, meaning to be, to exist, to happen. It is in the imperfect tense, which in Hebrew carries a sense of ongoing, continuous, unfinished action. Not I was, not I will be, I am, continuously, without beginning, without interruption, without end. Many scholars believe the name suggests something like the one who causes to be, or the self-existent one, or simply existence itself. The one from whom all being derives. Keep that detail in mind. It comes back. Now jump forward 14 centuries. Jerusalem, the Feast of Tabernacles, a city swollen with pilgrims who have come to commemorate the 40 years their ancestors spent wandering in the wilderness, dwelling in temporary shelters, surviving on bread that fell from the sky. Jesus is teaching in the temple courts, and the crowd is divided. Some think he is the prophet, the one Moses predicted in Deuteronomy 18. Some think he is the Messiah. Some think he is a dangerous fraud from the wrong city, because everyone knows the Messiah comes from Bethlehem, and this man is from Galilee. The Pharisees confront him, and they ask him directly, "Who are you?" John chapter 8, verse 25. And here is where most translations smooth this over. The original does not. The Greek phrase Jesus responds with is one that translators have argued about for centuries. Some render it, just what I have been claiming all along. Others render it, why do I speak to you at all? The Greek is ego ten, archon hotikai lalo human. It is ambiguous in a way that appears to be deliberate. The word arch-en can mean beginning or principle, or it can function idiomatically as a marker of emphasis. Jesus does not say, I am the Messiah. He does not say, I am the Son of God. He does not give them a title they can immediately accept or immediately arrest him for. Instead, he shifts the conversation. He says the one who sent him is true. He says what he has heard from the Father. He tells the world. He pushes the question back into the relationship between himself and the one who sent him. Why? Here is where it gets deeper. In the 1st century Jewish world, identity was not primarily a matter of personal declaration. It was a matter of witness. The Torah required 2 or 3 witnesses to establish any legal claim. A man who testified only about himself, under Jewish law, was considered to have given inadmissible evidence. This is not a small detail. This is the entire legal and cultural framework within which Jesus was operating. When the Pharisees challenge Jesus in John chapter 8, they say exactly this: "You are testifying about yourself. Your testimony is not valid." They are not being petty, they are citing the law. Deuteronomy 17, verse 6, Numbers 35, verse 30, 2 or 3 witnesses. Without that, no claim could be legally established. Under the legal standards of the day, a direct self-declaration, "I am the Messiah," would have been instantly dismissible, not because it lacked sincerity, but because it lacked witnesses. And Jesus knew this. So watch what he does instead. He does not answer the who question with a title. He answers it with an action. He answers it with witnesses. He answers it with patterns. He says in John chapter 5, "The works I do in my Father's name testify about me." He says in John chapter 10, "The works themselves testify that the Father has sent me." He says in John chapter 14, "Believe me when I say I am in the Father, and the Father is in me," or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. This is not evasion. This is the most legally sound, culturally precise, and epistemically rigorous answer he could possibly give under the standards of his own tradition. He is saying, "I will not tell you who I am, I will show you." And the showing will be the telling. But there is another layer under this one, and this is where it gets remarkable. The I am statements in the Gospel of John are not random spiritual poetry. They are the most loaded phrases in the entire Jewish tradition, and John appears to have arranged them with extraordinary care. There are 7 of them. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. 7. In Hebrew thought, the number of completion, of wholeness. Of the days of creation, the number that signals a pattern has reached its fullness. But these are not just poetic metaphors strung together for beauty. Each one is a direct echo of how God described himself, or was described, in the Hebrew scriptures. And John appears to have constructed them so that each one lands on a listener who knows the tradition like a tuning fork, hitting exactly the right frequency. The bread of life. This calls back to the manna in the wilderness, where God said to Moses in Exodus 16, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." The Israelites ate bread they did not plant, that came from a source they could not explain, for 40 years. Now Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry." The parallel is not accidental. He is not just using food as a metaphor, he is stepping into the role that the wilderness narrative had assigned to God alone, the light of the world. Psalm 27 opens with the declaration, "The Lord is my light and my salvation." Isaiah 42 describes the servant of the Lord as a light to the nations. In the creation narrative of Genesis 1, the first thing God speaks into existence is light, before the sun or moon or stars exist to provide it. Light, in the Hebrew imagination, is not primarily physical. It is the presence of the divine order breaking into chaos. When Jesus says, "I am the light of the world," every listener who knows the Psalms hears an echo they cannot unhear: the gate. This one is quieter, but it points to Psalm 118 verse 20, which says, "This is the gate of the Lord through which the righteous may enter." The gate is not neutral architecture. In the Psalms, the gate is the point of access to the presence of God. Jesus says, "I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved." This is where most people stop, and they miss everything: the Good Shepherd. Psalm 23 is perhaps the most beloved text in the entire Hebrew Bible. The Lord is my shepherd. But Ezekiel 34 is equally pointed. God speaks directly to the leaders of Israel who have failed their flock and says, "I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. I myself will tend my sheep. I myself will rescue them." The repetition of "I myself" in Ezekiel 34 is emphatic in the Hebrew, a rhetorical intensity that signals God is not delegating this task to any human intermediary. God will personally be the shepherd. When Jesus says in John chapter 10, "I am the good shepherd," he is not offering a new metaphor. He is stepping into a role that Ezekiel had explicitly reserved for God alone, the resurrection and the life. In Daniel chapter 12 verse 2, the text says that multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. The Hebrew imagination consistently placed the authority over life and death with God alone. 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 6 says, "The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up." Deuteronomy 32 verse 39 records God saying, "I put to death and I bring to life." When Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life," he is claiming the one prerogative that the entire Hebrew tradition had reserved exclusively for the divine: the way, the truth, and the life. Psalm 119, the longest chapter in the Bible, is an extended meditation on the ways of God, the truth of God's instruction, and the life that comes from following it. The word way in Hebrew, derek, and in Greek, hodos, carries a sense of both path and manner of living. When Jesus says he is the way, he is not saying he is the road you travel. He is saying he is the derek, the manner of life, the pattern of existence that the entire tradition had been pointing toward, and the true vine. In Isaiah chapter 5, God describes Israel as his vineyard, a vine he planted with care, that produced wild grapes instead of good ones. In Psalm 80 verse 8, the psalmist describes Israel as a vine God brought out of Egypt. The vine is consistently used in the Hebrew scriptures as an image of God's people, tended by God, accountable to God. When Jesus says, "I am the true vine," he is not just offering agricultural imagery. He is saying, what Israel was meant to be, I am. The perfect embodiment of the covenant relationship between the divine and humanity. 7 statements. 7 echoes from the Hebrew tradition, each one quiet enough to pass as metaphor, each one loud enough to ears trained in the text to carry the full weight of the divine name behind it. What comes next reframes everything before it. But the most explosive moment in this entire pattern comes in a single verse that most readers pass over without realizing what just happened. John chapter 8, verse 58. The Pharisees are arguing with Jesus about Abraham. They say that Abraham is their father. Jesus says that Abraham rejoiced to see his day. They say, incredulously, "You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham?" And Jesus says this, "Before Abraham was, I am, not I was, not I existed before Abraham was, I am." The Greek is prin abram genestai, ego eimi. The word genestai, applied to Abraham, is in the aorist tense, a completed action. Abraham came into being. Abraham had a beginning. But the verb applied to Jesus is present tense, ego eimi, I am, continuous, uninterrupted, without beginning. This is the exact linguistic and theological form of the divine name spoken to Moses from the burning bush. And the crowd knew it immediately. John says they picked up stones to throw at him, not because he had made an audacious claim about his age, not because he had said something logically impossible, but because they understood, instantly, that he had just spoken the name of God in the first person. In the first century, the divine name was not spoken aloud. To hear it was already weighty. To hear a human being speak it in the first person, as a self-description, was the gravest possible blasphemy. Leviticus 24, verse 16. Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. The entire assembly must stone them. They did not pick up stones because they misunderstood him. They picked up stones because they understood him perfectly. He did not say, "I am the Messiah." He said, "I am." And in that moment, every listener in that temple court would have heard 14 centuries of Israelite history collapse into a single breath. The God who spoke to Abraham, the God who appeared to Moses, the God who delivered Israel from Egypt, the God who spoke from Sinai, the God whose name was too holy to pronounce, was standing in front of them, in sandals, covered in the dust of a Galilean road. Keep that detail in mind, because it explains everything that comes before it. Every time Jesus deflected the direct question of who he was not avoiding the answer. He was protecting the conditions under which the answer could actually land. Consider what would have happened if he had said, "I am" in week 1. Before the healings, before the feeding of the 5,000. Before the raising of Lazarus, before the Sermon on the Mount, before Nicodemus, before the woman at the well, he would have been stoned in Galilee before his ministry had a chance to establish itself. And even if he had survived, the claim would have had nothing to land in, no pattern of works to confirm it, no weeks of encounter to prepare the listener for the weight of it. The I am in John chapter 8 is not a slip. It is the destination of a carefully structured journey. And John chapter 8 is not early in the gospel. It is chapter 8 of 21. By the time Jesus speaks those 2 words, the reader has watched him turn water into wine, heal a royal official's son from a distance, restore a paralyzed man who had been waiting for 38 years, feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and walk across the surface of a lake in the middle of the night. The claim lands differently when it lands on top of all of that. This is where the feeding of the 5,000 deserves more attention than it usually gets. John chapter 6. A crowd of 5,000 men, plus women and children, has followed Jesus to the far side of the Sea of Galilee. Evening is coming. They are in a remote place. There is no food. Jesus asks Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" John adds a parenthetical observation here that is easy to miss. He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. What he was going to do was take 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish from a boy in the crowd, give thanks, and distribute them to 5,000 people, with 12 basketfuls of broken pieces left over after everyone had eaten their fill. Now, the crowd's response is immediate and telling. John chapter 6, verse 14. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." The prophet, the one Moses predicted in Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you." But then John adds something stunning. Verse 15. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. They wanted to make him king by force, and he fled. This is the trap in its clearest form. They had a category ready. They had experienced a miracle that, in their minds, confirmed that category. And they were about to take action based on their category, rather than on anything Jesus had actually said or established about who he was. If he had allowed it, he would have been trapped inside the wrong story. A political Messiah who overthrew Rome, distributed bread, and sat on a throne in Jerusalem, which is not what he came to do. The answer changes depending on which word you look at. The next day, the crowd finds him on the other side of the lake and asks, essentially, "How did you get here?" And Jesus says something they did not expect. He says, "You are looking for me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." He is making a distinction between the miracle and the sign, between the bread and what the bread was pointing to. He says, "Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life." And then he says, "I am the bread of life." The crowd's response is not wonder, it is offense. Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, "I came down from heaven"? They had a category for him, son of Joseph, a man from Nazareth, someone whose family they knew, and everything he was saying was trying to break out of that category. This is the pattern. Every time someone tried to place Jesus inside an existing container, the container broke. And rather than find a new container, most people chose to be offended by the breaking. Here is where it gets deeper. Now look at what happens in Caesarea Philippi, Matthew chapter 16. The location itself is significant. Caesarea Philippi was a city built against a massive rock face, at the base of which was a cave known as the Gates of Hades. It was a pagan sanctuary, a place where Pan was worshipped, where the rock opened into what people believed was a literal entrance to the underworld. Herod Philip had built the city and named it partly after Caesar. The political and spiritual power of the empire was embedded in the very geography of the place. Jesus takes his disciples there deliberately, and it is here, in the shadow of the gates of Hades, against the backdrop of Rome's power and pagan worship, that he asks them the question, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" The disciples give the popular answers. John the Baptist, raised from the dead. Elijah, returning as Malachi had predicted. Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. All of them are putting Jesus in a category. All of them are saying, "He is like this figure we already know. He fits here. He belongs in this tradition." And then Jesus turns the question directly to them. "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answers, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And here is what Jesus does not do. He does not say, "Yes, that is exactly right." He does not confirm the category. He says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." He deflects the affirmation upward. He attributes the knowledge not to human reasoning, not to Peter's theological study, but to divine revelation. And then, immediately, Matthew 16, verse 20, he instructs the disciples to tell no one that he is the Messiah. The Messianic secret, as scholars sometimes call it. It runs through Matthew, Mark, and Luke with striking consistency. Every time someone recognizes him, he tells them to be quiet about it. Why? Because the word Messiah was already full. It already had a meaning in first-century Jewish expectation. A military liberator, a new David, someone who would drive out the Romans, restore the throne, and inaugurate a kingdom of Israel's political and territorial supremacy. That expectation was not wrong about everything. The Messiah was expected to bring justice, to defeat oppression, to establish peace. But the mechanism and the timeline and the nature of the battle were entirely different from what the crowds imagined. If Jesus had confirmed the title without first redefining everything the title meant, the category would have won. The crowds would have bent him to fit their expectation, rather than allowing him to reshape the expectation entirely. And that one word changes everything. Because what Jesus actually did with the messianic expectation was not reject it. He inhabited it from the inside and turned it inside out. He entered Jerusalem on a donkey, not a warhorse. He cleansed the temple, not the Roman barracks. He established a new covenant not with military victory, but with broken bread and poured wine the night before his death. He defeated death not by killing his enemies, but by dying and rising. Every element of the messianic expectation was present. Justice, liberation, a new kingdom, defeat of the enemy, eternal peace. But none of it arrived by the mechanism the category had predicted. Now look at what happens at the end of his life. Jesus is standing before Pilate, John chapter 18, verses 33 through 38. Pilate asks him directly, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus, consistent to the very end, does not give a direct answer. He asks Pilate where the question is coming from. Is it his own question, or did others suggest it to him? Pilate is frustrated. He says, "Am I a Jew? Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" And Jesus says something stunning. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." He does not say, "Yes, I am the king." He does not say, "No, I am not the king." He reframes the entire question by redefining the category. If you try to fit me into your existing category of what a king is, the answer is no. But if you are willing to let the category itself be rebuilt from the ground up, then yes. But not in any way your current framework can hold. Pilate then presses again, "So you are a king then?" And Jesus says, "You say that I am a king." He lets Pilate's own words do the work. He does not grab the title. He does not refuse the title. He allows it to hang in the air, accurate in a way that Pilate cannot fully understand, and inadequate in a way that Jesus will not pretend is sufficient. Most translations smooth this over. The original does not. The Greek construction Jesus uses with Pilate is the same type of construction he used with the high priest Caiaphas the night before, when Caiaphas asked him directly whether he was the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. Mark chapter 14, verse 62. Jesus says, "I am." Ego eimi, the same words, the same weight, the divine name, again spoken in the first person. And then immediately after saying it, he shifts into Daniel's apocalyptic language. He says, "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." He gives the direct answer only once. And he gives it at the moment when it can no longer be used to build the wrong kind of movement, when it can only be used to condemn him, when the revelation of identity has nowhere to go except the cross. Here is where it gets deeper, because even the phrase "Son of Man" is itself a masterwork of deliberate ambiguity. Jesus uses this title for himself more than any other across all four Gospels. More than Messiah, more than Son of God, more than Lord. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. The Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Son of Man. In Aramaic, bar anasha, which in its most basic sense simply means a human being, a man, a mortal, the Aramaic equivalent of saying this person or someone like me. Some first-century Aramaic speakers used bar anasha as an indirect way of referring to themselves, the way a person in certain cultures might say, "One does not simply do that," to mean "I would not do that." But the phrase also directly echoes one of the most dramatic visions in the entire Hebrew Bible. Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Daniel sees a vision in the night. He sees 4 terrifying beasts representing 4 empires rising from the sea, and then he sees another figure. Not a beast, not rising from the sea, but coming with the clouds of heaven. The text says this figure is like a son of man, Bar Enash in Aramaic, a human figure approaching the Ancient of Days, which is Daniel's way of describing God himself, seated on a throne of fire. And this figure, the one who looks like a human being, is given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and languages worship him. His dominion is everlasting. His kingdom will never be destroyed. This is not a minor passage. By the 1st century, this vision from Daniel 7 had become one of the most discussed texts in Jewish apocalyptic literature. The figure was widely interpreted as either a symbol for the faithful people of Israel or as a specific divine agent who would appear at the end of history to establish God's final kingdom. The phrase sits in two categories at once: completely human, cosmically divine. When Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, every listener has to make a choice about which meaning they are hearing. Is this just a man speaking about himself in the third person? Or is this a direct claim to be the figure from Daniel's apocalyptic vision, the one who comes on the clouds of heaven with universal authority? The text does not resolve this tension, it holds it. And the reason the text holds it is the same reason Jesus never gave a clean, categorical answer to who he was. The categories available to his listeners were insufficient. You cannot pour something entirely new into an existing container and expect the container to survive unchanged. This is not metaphor. This is the literal history of every moment in the Gospels where someone tried to fit Jesus into an existing category and discovered that the category kept breaking. The crowd wanted a miracle worker. He kept pointing beyond the miracles. The Pharisees wanted a rabbi who would operate within their interpretive framework. He kept reinterpreting the framework itself. The scribes wanted someone who would cite prior authorities for every teaching. He said, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." The zealots wanted a revolutionary. He told his followers to love their enemies and pray for those who persecuted them. The disciples wanted a king. He washed their feet. Every category offered to him, he took and quietly turned inside out. And that one word changes everything. Because if Jesus had simply said, "I am the Messiah, the Son of God, the divine King," in the plain, direct, declarative form his questioners kept demanding, what would have happened? The religious leaders would have had immediate grounds for blasphemy charges before the pattern of his ministry had time to establish itself. The crowds would have immediately projected their military revolutionary expectations onto him and been either violently disappointed or violently energized in exactly the wrong direction. His followers would have organized around a title rather than around a transforming encounter with a person. The story that needed to be told through action, through death and resurrection, would have been short-circuited by a declaration that the audience was not yet equipped to receive correctly. And perhaps most importantly, the question of who he was would have been settled too easily. A label accepted is a label that stops the searching. But a question that is answered obliquely, that is answered by action and pattern and echo and witness, that is a question that keeps pulling the listener forward. "Who do you say that I am?" he asked his disciples that. He did not ask what title they had heard applied to him. He asked what they, personally, had arrived at, because the destination was not a correct doctrinal answer. The destination was a personal encounter with someone who could not be fully contained by any existing human category. And if they reached that encounter by following the evidence, by watching the works, by sitting with the I am statements and feeling the weight of each one, by noticing that this man forgave sins and calmed storms and fed thousands and raised the dead, they would arrive somewhere no title alone could have taken them. What comes next reframes everything before it. There is a moment near the end of John's Gospel that functions like a key to everything we have been tracing. John chapter 20, verse 31. John steps outside the narrative for a moment and explains why he wrote the whole thing. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. He states the title plainly. After 20 chapters of evidence, encounter, miracle, teaching, death, and resurrection, the title was not withheld because it was untrue. It was withheld, structured, and revealed incrementally because the truth was too large to be received all at once. The Gospel of John is, among other things, a carefully designed journey toward a conclusion that must be earned by the reader, the same way it had to be earned by the disciples. You do not arrive at the identity of Jesus by being told the answer at the door. You arrive at it by walking through the entire house. Every time Jesus deflected the direct question, he was not protecting a secret. He was protecting the process of encounter, the process of accumulating evidence, the process of having your existing categories broken open and rebuilt around something larger than they were designed to hold. Because a person who is told the answer and accepts it intellectually is not in the same position as a person who has followed the evidence all the way to the edge of what their categories can hold and then watched those categories collapse under the weight of something they could not explain away. The first person has a belief. The second person has been changed. And that is the difference Jesus appears to have been protecting throughout every indirect answer, every deflection, every "you say that I am," every careful pivot away from the title and toward the works, toward the witnesses, toward the patterns, toward the slow accumulation of evidence that finally breaks open into something the language barely has room for. Before Abraham was, I am. Not a title. Not a category, not a label that can be worn or rejected without cost, just the most extraordinary claim ever made in the quiet interior of a temple argument. The self-existent, burning bush presence. The one who told Moses his name was pure existence, saying, in the grammar of that same name, that he was here. Now. In that courtyard. In that argument. If he had said it at the beginning, it would have been a statement. Stated at the end, after everything else, it was a revelation. And there is a difference between being told something is true and arriving at the place where you can see it for yourself. The Gospels seem to understand that difference better than almost anything else ever written. They are not designed to give you the answer. They are designed to make you the kind of person capable of receiving it. And that may be why the question that follows Jesus through the entire narrative was never fully answered in any single sentence, because the answer, when it finally arrives, is not something you hear. It is something that happens to you.